Welcome back to Last Records. Today we're unpacking outdoor trips that turned into final trips, because nature does give warnings, but it doesn't take excuses. From a woman being crushed in an improvised gondola, to a visitor falling 50 feet in a state forest, where what was found later about the plunge shocked everyone in the worst way possible. It was September 18, 2020. Over Eloy, Arizona, clear desert skies stretched above Skydive, Arizona's drop zone, as aircraft released jumpers over flat farmland and service roads below. Kieran Villara was 32, an experienced recreational skydiver with roughly 600 log jumps. He was not part of a competition team, but within his local group he was regarded as steady and precise, especially in canopy control and landing accuracy. He had traveled to Eloy for a weekend of routine jumps with a small group of acquaintances he had trained alongside over several seasons. The jump that morning was a standard high-altitude deployment. Conditions were stable, with light upper winds and clear visibility across the designated landing fields. Kieran exited the aircraft without incident and deployed his main canopy at the expected altitude. His initial descent was controlled, with a stable glide path and no visible instability in the canopy. At mid-descent, another skydiver from a separate load experienced an off-heading opening and began drifting outside their intended landing corridor. The wind profile at altitude was layered but mild, creating slight horizontal separation between descent paths that did not fully converge until lower altitude. Kieran adjusted his flight path to maintain spacing and avoid the primary landing cluster. This is where things get tricky. Everyone's correcting at the same time, but nobody has the same picture of where the others are moving. As he corrected course, he drifted laterally toward a service perimeter bordering the drop zone. It was an area used for vehicles, staging equipment, and maintenance access normally outside active landing paths, but still open terrain with no hard physical barriers. At the same time, a second canopy descending from a different sequence entered an unplanned drift line due to a partial line twist recovery that altered its heading during stabilization. The two descent paths converged at a low altitude with limited lateral separation, leaving only a brief window for avoidance. Kieran initiated a final flare adjustment and lateral input, but the closing angle reduced available separation. The canopies made contact, resulting in a partial collapse and immediate disruption of lift, destabilizing his descent. Once canopies touch, you don't really get control back, it just becomes physics from there. His canopy partially collapsed on impact, resulting in a rapid loss of control and a steep, uncontrolled descent from a reduced but still fatal height. He struck a compact dirt service road near the edge of the landing field, impacting primarily on his upper torso and head. His body came to rest near equipment staged along the perimeter. Emergency personnel on site initiated a response immediately after witnessing the impact, and reached him within minutes. Advanced trauma care was initiated on contact, but injuries were consistent with catastrophic blunt force trauma and no survivable interval. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A post-incident examination determined the cause of death to be severe head and thoracic trauma consistent with high-energy ground impact following mid-air canopy collision and loss of lift control. Toxicology results were negative, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The incident review found both jumpers were within standard procedures, but overlapping canopy flight paths and staggered deployment led to a loss of separation. Wind drift contributed to an unplanned convergence. I've seen how quickly spacing disappears once people start correcting at different altitudes. It doesn't take much. No equipment malfunction was found, and the report noted that layered winds and timing can still produce overlap even under standard guidelines. Following the incident, operations in the affected landing sector were temporarily paused for a review of canopy separation practices during peak jump activity. Kieran's logbook and equipment were returned to his family. His final jump entry remained unchanged, recorded without annotation beyond standard completion. Next up, it's a fair ride that looks routine at first, until I'm watching it turn into something that has to be improvised in real time. It was July 6, 2015. A county fairground in Bemidji, Minnesota was crowded by early afternoon, with families moving between livestock stalls and food stands under rising heat and steady summer activity that gave no indication of disruption. Jahan Paulson was 43, a public high school biology teacher in Bemidji who lived alone and was well regarded for her practical, steady teaching style and dry humor. She had no public presence and attended the county fair as a long-standing personal tradition, joining her neighbor, Dorothea Cole, 67, and Dorothea's two grandchildren, including 9-year-old Risha. I don't see anything unusual in their setup here. This is just a normal shared family outing.
They boarded a portable Ferris wheel gondola operated by a contracted amusement company,
with Jahan accompanying Risha while Dorothea remained on the ground. The ride had a minor maintenance history and had passed inspection earlier that day. A drive system malfunction stopped the wheel during operation, and ride personnel attempted to reposition it manually under maintenance procedures, but the effort stalled with Jahan's gondola still elevated above the normal unloading position. The braking and positioning system was not fully locking under uneven load, and as passengers were removed one by one, the resulting weight imbalance and residual mechanical tension allowed slight movement in the wheel, causing the gondola to settle unexpectedly during evacuation.
After several attempts to restart the ride and no immediate outside assistance, staff proceeded with an improvised evacuation.
They set up an aluminum extension ladder against the structure and began lowering passengers one by one from the stalled gondola. Because the wheel's curve created uneven gaps, passengers had to step carefully while holding the rail for balance. Risha went first and was safely guided across and down the ladder to the ground. I keep thinking if I were in Risha's position, I'd be focusing entirely on just getting off safely and not looking around at anything else. Staff proceeded with a ladder evacuation because there were no immediate high-angle rescue teams on site, and standard reset attempts had failed. With passengers left suspended and the ride still unstable, they opted for a rapid manual evacuation to reduce time at height rather than wait for external responders. As Jahan prepared to follow, the gondola shifted slightly due to residual tension in the braking system and uneven load distribution from the previous exit. In that brief movement, her transition step misaligned with the ladder rung. She instinctively reached to steady herself on the gondola frame, but her body was pushed inward against the gondola's rigid edge as it settled. As the gondola shifted, her upper body entered a narrowing gap between the gondola frame and a fixed structural member of the wheel. When the gondola settled under load, her chest and upper abdomen became trapped within the pinch point. It happened suddenly. With no warning, her upper chest and abdomen were pressed hard against the metal edge. Staff tried to stop the wheel right away, but by that point the system had already locked into place under the load, so there wasn't any further movement they could prevent.
Ride personnel quickly reversed the pressure and freed Jian from the entrapment.
Emergency responders arrived shortly after and began advanced resuscitative care, but she was already deceased. Risha had been led away and did not witness the incident. A post-incident medical examination determined the cause of death to be catastrophic blunt force crush injuries, including multiple rib fractures, severe thoracic and pulmonary trauma, a major liver laceration, and extensive internal hemorrhage from chest and upper abdominal compression. Toxicology was negative, and the death was ruled accidental. The incident review found the evacuation placed passengers into an unregulated transition zone between the gondola and ladder alignment, compounded by the lack of a defined high-angle rescue protocol for the ride's stopped configuration. Residual movement in the braking system under load was identified as a contributing factor to the sudden shift that led to the entrapment.
My view is, the system only works when everything stays in place, and once it doesn't, there's almost no margin left.
The fair closed early afterward. Subsequent inspections found multiple safety and documentation deficiencies. The operator received regulatory citations and later ceased ride operations in the region. Jahan's classroom was renamed in her honor, and former students continued a yearly tradition of leaving flowers at the fairground's entrance.
From there, a park set up in Ohio, where something solid-looking has been weakening in the background for a long time.
It was September 8th, 2020. A community park in Columbus, Ohio was quiet by late afternoon under overcast skies, with low foot traffic and an outdoor fitness area near the parking lot that appeared unchanged from previous years. Kwame Asante was 37, a licensed HVAC technician with over 11 years of residential and light commercial experience and 2 state certifications. He was a father of 2 daughters in a shared custody arrangement following a separation in 2018. After his commercial gym closed during the early pandemic period, he began using an outdoor fitness area at a community park after work as a simple routine rather than structured training. I can see this more as a quick after-work habit than anything intentional or risky. The park's fitness area had a few metal exercise stations, all bolted down into concrete. They were originally installed by a private manufacturer that, by that point, had ceased operations, leaving ongoing maintenance responsibility with the municipality. One of them was a standing rotary torso machine, a central post set into concrete with a rotating upper section and side handles for twisting. Maintenance records had noted minor movement at the base over time, initially treated as non-critical. By late 2019, it was placed on a deferred maintenance list due to budget constraints, and no repair work was completed. Over time, a hairline crack in the footing widened, and 2 of the 4 anchor bolts gradually loosened. Externally, the unit still appeared stable, but its structural integrity had steadily degraded beneath the surface. Kwame moved through a short sequence of equipment stations before using the rotary torso trainer. Security footage from nearby parking infrastructure later confirmed his presence, though the fitness area itself had no dedicated surveillance. He began a set of twisting repetitions, first left and then right, gradually increasing force as the set progressed. During a rightward rotation, the already compromised footing failed as the cracked concrete and loosened anchor bolts gave way. The upright post lost structural integrity. In the entire assembly, several hundred pounds of steel and concrete shifted abruptly and collapsed laterally.
I don't usually think of outdoor gym equipment as something that can just fail like this, but once the base goes, that's exactly what happens.
Kwame's hands remained on the handles as the structure fell, limiting his ability to react. The metal frame struck his upper chest and shoulder before pinning him against the ground. The weight of the unit compressed his chest and upper torso against the concrete surface, trapping him beneath it. A nearby park visitor heard a sharp crack and metallic impact and called emergency services while moving toward the scene. Kwame remained partially conscious but was unable to free himself. A second bystander attempted to assist, but the structure could not be moved by hand. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, used hydraulic tools to lift the equipment, and transported him to a regional hospital where he was later pronounced dead. A post-incident examination determined the cause of death to be traumatic asphyxia with catastrophic blunt force thoracic injuries. Multiple right rib fractures were driven inward, causing lung collapse, while the left lung was compressed. Severe chest compression led to airway compromise and rapid respiratory failure. Additional injuries included fractures to the clavicle, shoulder blade, and cervical spine, consistent with high-force compression. Toxicology was negative, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The investigation concluded that long-term structural degradation, progressive footing cracks, loosening anchor bolts, deferred maintenance, and unresolved inspection findings directly contributed to the collapse. The unit had remained in service despite known stability concerns and recommendations for repair. Honestly, it stops being about a single moment and becomes about how long a weakened system is allowed to keep running.
Following the incident, the city removed multiple aging outdoor fitness installations and introduced stricter inspection requirements, including mandatory engineering reviews for older equipment.
A civil settlement was reached with Kwame's family, and his certification plaques were preserved by his mother for his daughters. Next case, it feels solid at first, until hidden rock fractures turn a properly installed anchor into sudden failure. It was June 12, 2018. The Wasatch foothills outside Salt Lake City were dry and bright under late morning sun, with scattered cloud cover drifting over a popular climbing access area near a narrow canyon trailhead used by both hikers and technical climbers. Darren James Holcomb was 38, a recreational climber with several years of informal outdoor experience, mostly self-guided trips on established routes. He worked in IT support in Salt Lake City and spent weekends hiking and climbing moderate-grade rock faces with friends or alone when schedules didn't align. He was familiar with basic rope systems and top rope setups but had no formal certification or guiding experience.
That morning, he arrived at a mixed-use climbing area where a fixed anchor had already been installed in the rock face for recreational use.
It had been worked on a few weeks earlier after some minor wear was noticed, and a maintenance crew had replaced one of the bolts. When I hear that it was just replaced, I don't take it as automatically safe. I've seen too many cases where the rock underneath is the real problem. Everything matched the right specs, at least on paper, but the rock itself had hidden fractures underneath the surface that weren't visible from the outside, so the bolt never fully seated into truly solid rock. Darren set up a top rope solo system using the fixed anchor point at the top of a short but exposed root, relying on a self-belay configuration designed to feed rope through a progress capture device as he ascended. Conditions were stable, with dry rock and light wind. He completed his safety checks and began ascending the face at a controlled pace, using standard movement techniques and resting intermittently on ledges along the route.
As he neared the upper section, the load on the anchor system increased due to rope angle and body position relative to the overhang.
The hidden fracture zone within the rock face began to propagate under sustained tension, gradually shifting micro-movements into structural instability at the anchor point. While Darren was transitioning from a handhold to a higher ledge, the anchor assembly experienced sudden failure. The bolt pulled free from compromised rock, and the entire load shifted instantly. And it's never gradual. When it finally goes, it's just gone. The anchor just gave way completely, and the fixed point he was relying on was gone in an instant. The rope, which had been running through his self-belay device as he climbed, suddenly went slack and lost any real tension control. From there, it just started running freely, and the device didn't have time to catch anything before everything was already moving too fast. A self-belay system still relies on a solid anchor above. Once the anchor pulled out of the rock, there was nothing left for the device to work against, and the entire system failed at the same moment. He fell from a height of approximately 30 to 40 feet, with uncontrolled rope slack allowing a brief pendulum effect against the rock face before he dropped to the base of the formation. The lack of an effective top anchor meant there was no meaningful energy absorption before ground impact. Nearby climbers heard the sudden release and impact, and called emergency services immediately. A group on a nearby route reached him within minutes and initiated assistance, but injuries were immediately catastrophic and non-survivable.
He was pronounced dead at the scene. When people are already on the wall, they're usually the first ones there, way before any responders can even get close.
A post-incident examination determined the cause of death to be severe blunt force trauma and internal injury consistent with a high-energy fall onto rock, including multiple spinal fractures, thoracic compression injuries, and severe traumatic brain injury. Toxicology was negative, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The investigation concluded that the anchor failure resulted from concealed geological fracturing within the rock formation, combined with load transfer stress that exceeded the compromised rock's structural capacity. The replacement bolt itself was found to be correctly installed, but the surrounding substrate was deemed unsuitable for sustained climbing loads. Following the incident, access to the route was permanently closed, and additional geological assessments were ordered across similar climbing areas in the region. Fixed anchor placements in comparable formations were later re-evaluated under stricter geological stability criteria. Here, an anchor can look solid, but the rock behind it may not actually hold. Then, an open rooftop space where familiar movement crosses an unseen weak point. It was August 14, 2017. Memphis was already warm that early in the morning, with that heavy air that just kind of hangs over everything in the crosstown warehouse district. The rooftops and service structures were still quiet, like the whole area was waiting for the day to start. Jedrick Busio was 24. He worked as a shipping coordinator at a regional freight company and grew up in Whitehaven. In his free time, he got into parkour mostly self-taught from online videos in his early 20s. He usually ran alone on weekends, sometimes with a close friend. He'd also filmed some of his rooftop routes for a small video channel he ran with a modest following. No sponsorships, no formal training, just him doing it on his own. 5 days earlier, a contracted HVAC technician had performed maintenance on a rooftop service hatch in the same district.
I don't usually think much about rooftop spaces like this, but they always have more hidden access points than they first appear to.
After the work was completed, the locking mechanism was not properly re-engaged, leaving the panel appearing closed but not actually secured. The issue went undocumented and was not noticed during routine exterior inspection. Jedrick arrived in the area shortly after sunrise after spending the night editing prior footage. His recording setup was already familiar to him, a chest-mounted camera and a phone rig used for secondary angles. Security footage later confirmed he moved across the building access points with routine confidence, following a rooftop path he had used many times before. However, this particular hatch had recently been serviced and sat flush with the roof surface, making it indistinguishable from the surrounding maintenance panels. Nothing about its appearance suggested any immediate hazard.
On the northeast section of the rooftop, he transitioned into a short approach run across a gravel-covered stretch leading toward clustered mechanical units.
The hatch appeared fully secured as he reached it at speed, and his lead foot landed directly on it. This is the kind of detail that feels completely harmless right up until it isn't. The panel gave way immediately under his weight, offering no meaningful resistance, and he dropped through the opening as his momentum carried the rest of his body forward. His lower leg went through first, followed by a violent forward rotation that pulled his torso and upper body into the shaft. He fell approximately 2 stories into the shaft, striking internal structures before impacting a concrete landing at the base of a fixed metal ladder. The impact was immediate and severe, consistent with an uncontrolled oblique fall and secondary collision with structural surfaces during descent. A nearby resident heard a heavy impact, but did not recognize it as a fall and did not contact emergency services. Jedrick was not immediately discovered due to the concealed nature of the shaft and limited rooftop access. He was found several hours later after his friend, unable to reach him, located his parked vehicle and alerted building personnel. I always find it strange how something that loud can still be dismissed in a space like this. A post-incident medical examination determined death from catastrophic head and torso trauma consistent with a fall onto concrete, including a fatal skull fracture with extensive intracranial hemorrhaging, multiple rib fractures with associated internal organ damage, and severe fractures to the extremities. There was no survivable interval, toxicology was negative, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The investigation identified an unsecured rooftop hatch as the primary contributing factor, with the locking mechanism not fully re-engaged following prior maintenance. Additional factors included the absence of redundant securing measures and a lack of documented post-maintenance inspection. The managing company later settled civil claims out of court, and maintenance protocols were revised to require stricter lock verification and secondary securing systems for rooftop access points in similar facilities. The recovered footage was returned to his family through legal channels and not officially released, though it circulated informally online, while his channel remained active in name only, as viewers preserved his uploaded runs.
Alright, the final case. It is a scenic overlook where the barrier feels like a hard stop, until it gets treated like something that can just be crossed.
It was October 3, 2021. A scenic overlook along a state forest road in Washington state was quiet and cold at mid-morning under an overcast sky, with the valley below in full autumn color and only a few vehicles in the parking area. Garrett Tillinghast was 27, a remote data entry contractor in Tacoma who spent his free time photographing landscapes in relatively undiscovered locations found through hiking forums and older travel blogs. He worked alone on most trips, had no technical climbing background, and relied on basic footwear and minimal outdoor gear when visiting remote viewpoints. He arrived at a scenic overlook in Washington state to take photos of the valley and spent time shooting from the paved walkway near a wooden split-rail safety fence. That fence looks a lot more solid than the ground actually feels once you're standing near it. Just beyond that fence was a narrow strip of rocky ground. Then a steep drop made up of loose shale and moss-covered stone falling about 60 feet down to a talus field. At the entrance, there was a state forest sign with a ranger contact number, but he never ended up using it during his visit. After a period of shooting, Garrett placed his phone briefly on or near the upper rail while adjusting for a wider shot.
It slipped over the barrier and came to rest on the narrow ledge beyond the fence, landing face up on damp rock.
He saw it from the walkway side. The ranger station was several miles away, but he did not immediately seek assistance. After a brief pause and a visual assessment of the distance and terrain, he decided to retrieve it himself. He crossed the wooden rail by stepping over it using the lower rail for partial support, lowering himself onto the far side and placing his weight onto the narrow rocky strip. The surface was slick with moss and lichen, and his footwear provided little traction. He held the upper rail for balance while reaching for the phone. He managed to pick it up and secure it in his jacket pocket. As he began to straighten up to return to the walkway, his footing shifted. His left foot slipped, and his body was pushed outward off the ledge. He grabbed the railing with both hands, but ended up hanging on the outside of the barrier, with his feet sliding down the steep slope below the walkway. The way the rail and the slope were shaped just made it impossible for him to get solid footing again. And problem is, once you're outside a barrier like that on uneven ground, even a small shift in weight can be enough to take away any real chance of regaining balance. He remained suspended for a short period under strain, calling for help, but the overlook stayed empty. Eventually, his grip failed, and he fell down the rocky slope, tumbling approximately 40 to 50 feet before striking a basalt outcropping and continuing into the talus field below. A family arriving later contacted emergency services. Responders located Garrett unresponsive at the base and pronounced him dead at the scene. His phone was recovered from his jacket pocket, and his camera remained on the walkway where he had left it. What I notice is how quickly the place feels isolated once I'm just a few steps past the barrier. It goes from public and open to feeling completely cut off.
A post-incident examination determined the cause of death to be multiple blunt force traumatic injuries from a fall onto rocky terrain with a secondary impact against a basalt outcropping.
The first impact caused catastrophic head trauma, including a comminuted skull fracture and extensive intracranial hemorrhaging involving both cortical and deep structures, with severe traumatic brainstem injury consistent with rapid loss of neurological function. The subsequent descent caused additional fractures to the wrist and hip, extensive lacerations, and soft tissue injuries consistent with uncontrolled movement during the fall. Toxicology was negative, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The investigation concluded the incident began when he crossed a protective barrier to retrieve a dropped item from an unstable ledge above a steep slope, resulting in loss of traction and inability to return safely to the walkway. The overlook was temporarily closed and later upgraded with additional barrier fencing and signage, instructing visitors not to cross beyond the rail and to contact park services if items fall into restricted areas. Garrett's photography blog remains online, and his final post continues to receive occasional visitors.